world of Internet of Things panel. Got wonderful panelists here for you today. My name is Nader-Rezvani, and I have the pleasure of moderating this session for you. We're going to be talking about a topic that is near and dear to everyone's heart: your data, the privacy of your data in the world of connected devices. I think sometimes back in 2008, we had more connected devices than we had people on the face of the earth. And the trend has continued. Depending on what source you believe and you trust, there will be 50 billion, anywhere from 50 to 80 billion connected devices by the year 2020. We contribute to generating a lot of data on a regular basis. Every day, we add 500 terabytes of data on Facebook, 1 exabyte of data, that's 10 to the power of 18 on the internet, gets generated. And that's what we do. We generate a lot of digital prints on the internet, and we wonder what happens to the privacy of that. Some of that data that get collected, they're not that interesting. You know, the data that you collect from your light bulb by itself, or your toaster oven in your kitchen, but when you connect that with other data that you collect from your Fitbit, or your service provider, or your smart sprinkler system, baby monitor, Kitty can talk about and tell a story, a private and intimate story about your life. HP did a study that 90% of all the connected devices collect some sort of personal and private data. 70% of that data is not encrypted. So no wonder we hear a lot of stories on a daily basis about somebody's privacy has been compromised, a lot of data breaches. We just learned about 500 million emails that were stolen. And to make things even worse, our emails were being scanned for keywords to be handed over to the government to keep us safe. So we will be talking about the privacy, what it means in this world of connected devices. My name is nader-rezvani, as I mentioned. I'm a VP of Engineering at CA Technologies. I run a product team within our cybersecurity business unit where we focus on identity and access management, privileged access management. We have products in the cloud and on-premise. With me today, we have wonderful panelists. I have Sarah Squire, who is the founder and principal consultant at Engaged Identity. Sarah has acted as a subject matter expert in identity to several open standards such as UMA and NIST, and her focus is on healthcare and government sectors. Eve Schuler is the Director of Research in Emerging Architectures within the IOT group at Intel. She has led research on a range of topics on security and identity within Intel, and she's a co-chair of the NIST Cyber Physical Systems Working Group on data interoperability. And Michelle Dennedy, unfortunately, couldn't make it today. She was ill, but we found 2 wonderful panelists the last minute yesterday. Thank you so much, Jennifer and Rinky. Jennifer Granick is the Director of Civil Liberties at the Stanford Center for Internal and Society. She was the guest speaker, invited speaker yesterday. Before teaching at Stanford, she spent almost a decade practicing criminal defense law in California. She was selected by Information Security Magazine in 2003 as one of 20 women of vision in the computer security field. Last but not least is Rinky Sethi. She is an information security executive known for technology and change leadership. She is a senior director of security operations and strategy at Palo Alto Networks. Welcome, everybody. We will have a great time. Sarah just set up a hashtag for us, if you'd like to tweet about this. It's hashtag GHC IOT. If you'd like to tweet about this, that would be great. So we can go ahead and begin. I know I didn't do justice about your background, so with the first question, I'm going to start off with a very basic question about data privacy in the context of IoT. if you can please explain and describe, all of you who go around, what data privacy in the world of IoT really means to you, what excites you about it, and name one thing that keeps you up at night, frightens you. So Sarah, would you like to start here?
Sure. So as Naveed said, I'm Sarah Squire. I'm an independent consultant in identity and access management. I started my own company last year and just went full-time in January. The company's been wildly successful. It's a very growing field, and I really enjoyed it. It has a lot to do with data privacy and security. So to answer your question about definition of privacy, I'm glad you asked that because I gave a talk earlier this year at the Cloud Identity Summit called Identity in 1000 Words. So this is playing off of the Randall Munroe XKCD explain something technical using only the 1,000 most common English words. So I tried to explain identity and access management using only the 1,000 most common English words. Hilarity ensued. It's on YouTube. You can watch it. So privacy was one of the things I talked about, and the definition that we came up with was the ability to say who knows what about me. So it's not saying that you can't share, it's not saying that it's scary or that it's bad, it's just saying that you have control over where your data is going, who's getting it, where it's going to. And that's kind of the definition of privacy for me. What keeps me up at night?
Yeah.
It's a good question.
In relation to data privacy.
In relation to
There are a
data
lot of
privacy. It's probably all of the people who say, oh, we don't need encryption, and in fact encryption is bad. And that I really don't understand how you could possibly have privacy without having encryption. So that's what keeps me up at night.
Very cool. Thank you.
Okay, my definition of privacy, I guess to extend what you were saying, my standpoint, so my role at Intel is to really imagine what's happening with the evolution of the cloud architecture where everything's somewhere else. Well, it turns out that the IoT is really disruptive because so much of that data is getting produced at the edges of the network, and in fact there are lots of applications for which the cloud is too far away, the pipes have not been provisioned for that data inversion that's happening, it's all coming from the edges flowing upstream back to the cloud, that people don't, and there are industries that are prohibited from moving data from where it was originally generated. So that's my context within which I'm really thinking about privacy. And so from a data-centric standpoint, the way I might extend what you said was that the data begins life at the edge, and from a vendor standpoint, we want to make sure that only those people or entities that have been authorized to gain access to the data gain access, and those who have not been authorized are prohibited. And so that's the obligation of the vendors, the manufacturers, the software that we produce. They need to be able to provide that for privacy. What keeps me up at night? the idea that everything's going to be a camera. So people talk about smart lighting in the IoT, and what they mean is that every light bulb socket is going to allow you to put in a sensor hub. So it's not just going to be a light bulb. It's going to be able to take your temperature, the humidity, particulate matter in the air, and by the way, a mic and a microphone and a camera. So that's what scares me, that's what keeps me up at night. But you also asked what's exciting.
Right.
What's exciting is that as a consequence of all this data flowing, people will finally get back to the problem that, oh, privacy and security don't matter. The uber connectedness and the uber amount of data that's being produced about everything all the time is finally going to wake up people to consider this a critical problem to solve.
I hope you're right. That would be good. That would be great. So, for the thing that I care about related to privacy is power, and the reason why I study it is because information is power. And when someone has a lot of information about you, it gives them power over you. Much of my work these days is about government surveillance, so the ways that governments can exercise power over individuals and political activist groups, journalists, human rights workers, religious communities. But power is also something that's inherent in the private collection of data as well. And I personally like targeted advertising. I am excited by targeted advertising. I want the part where my phone buzzes and says, hey, it looks like you're near the grocery store and you don't have any milk. So get some milk, because waking up in the morning and trying to feed my kids without having anything for breakfast sucks. So I'm happy about that part. But the trade-off of that is that these private companies have all this data about us, and we don't really know the ways that it's being used to, sort of discriminate in rates that we get loans for, to show some people certain pictures or ads or Facebook posts that other people don't see, to do some kind of potentially discriminatory, like redlining. You can buy houses in this neighborhood, but we're not showing you houses in that neighborhood. We haven't really fully explored all the ways in which private collection of data is being used to offer people goods and services in potentially discriminatory ways. And I worry about that we're looking to, that we're sort of replicating, inadvertently replicating discriminatory patterns in our use of data. And the reason why IoT is so important is because we're all familiar with the ways that modern technology it basically records what we're doing online. But what IoT is doing is it's making that recording in our real lives too. And so it's taking all that information and making it all available together. So that is what keeps me up at night. And I worry as a lawyer, I worry about the ways in which the law is interfering with the development of technology and the deployment of strong encryption. And I worry about the ways in which the law is failing to protect data that we can't encrypt because we need it to be decrypted in order to do malware detection or recommendations or something like that. And there is, there's no reason to be fatalistic because law can play a role. And so I think a lot about what role the law should play and how we can get Congress to actually do something about it.
Thank you.
So when I think about my role at Palo Alto Networks and what we do, data privacy to me is data that shouldn't be public or isn't intended to be public doesn't become public, and that's my role as a security professional, to ensure that we're creating the right technologies to protect consumers, protect companies from just having data become public in a way that it's not supposed to for harm. And when I think about what data privacy could do and the harm that it could do, and that's what kind of keeps me up at night. Specifically, kind of flipping it, and I think a different perspective on topics we'll talk about today is that consumers really need to think about and own privacy for themselves as well, and understand the implications and how you're using your IoT devices and how you're setting up your privacy settings for different things as well, and users own that. What I love about IoT, I love that my son can yell at the Amazon Echo and say, play Katy Perry or roar by Katy Perry. I think that's awesome, and that's the kind of the convenience that it adds just to life, to people's lifestyles. I think IoT brings that. And the flip side is my son has no idea the privacy implications in what he's doing. So I think that's the side that really keeps me up at night.
Great, thank you. Let's see if I can. So let's talk about some of the things that you mentioned. Let's focus on the things that keep you up at night. Let's talk about the trend in data privacy, how things have evolved. A couple of years ago, nobody really thought about data privacy to that extent. The mere mortals, they didn't, okay, we're using this cool gadget, downloading this app. And so let's talk about some of the trends and how we have come to this point. And I'm really interested in learning about you, ladies, to see if you think the market will address some of these concerns. Where are we in our maturity right now, and do we know enough to be able to solve some of these problems? Anybody wants to chime in?
So I think the market has an adverse incentive to protect data, or not protect data, as it were. Which isn't to say that they're bad or they're evil, just to say that it's very profitable to collect and sell data. It is very expensive to properly and securely store data and make sophisticated APIs that only allow access to the people who are supposed to have it. So surely from a how do I make money as a business point of view, it makes a lot more sense to violate privacy concerns of your consumers, at least in the short run, than to protect them. So I don't see a market solution to it. Just yet.
I I also think that it's hard for us to really understand the privacy implications of some of the information that we give up, because Naveed, as you said, you give up, little pieces of information here and there, and we don't really understand how in aggregate they can be very, very revealing. So there's been studies that show that seemingly innocuous pieces of information like gender, zip code, and one other, do you remember what the study was? And age, gender, zip code.
Latanya Sweeney.
Latanya Sweeney, oh, she spoke here?
She spoke here.
Yeah, well, her work is awesome. You basically are like, do I care if somebody knows my zip code or my age? But you can identify something like 70% of people in the database just by these 3 very innocuous pieces of information. Or you can tell everything about people's patterns of interaction by who they email. There was this great article that a data scientist named Kieran Healy did about the ways we don't really understand how data analysis happens. It was basically, he took the people around the time of the Revolutionary War and what organizations they belonged to, and then he kind of flipped it and flipped the chart and was like, okay, who is the most connected person around the time of the Revolutionary War? And the most connected person was Paul Revere. And so if you were, the king, and you had the same computers that Kieran Healy did, then you would be like, let's make sure to arrest that Paul Revere dude, because he's the dangerous one. So we really don't understand that. And and you can't make good market choices, consumers can't make good market choices when the data science is so complicated that we don't really fully understand the implications of what giving up even seemingly innocuous pieces of information can do.
I was actually visiting my son over the weekend on the East Coast, and I went to Kroger's. And knowing that I was, can you hear me okay? Sorry. I was just mentioning that over the weekend, I live in California and I was on the East Coast, went to Kroger's to shop, and they asked me if I had an active account, and I said no. So they were asking me to provide my email address, my phone number, so that they could offer me 10 cents per gallon off next time I would put gas in my car. And it was interesting how people were willingly giving away the information because there was an incentive, like you mentioned.
And gas is really expensive in California, like people from here, but I saw how much gas is it's less than $2
I gave it all
a
away.
gallon.
I gave it all away. But I also remember way back when we had our social security numbers written on our checks, right? So, or in our class rings, it was engraved. So we all remember that. Great. So do you think, so based on what we said, where we are in the maturity, if we were to do a maturity, CMMI model that we used to do, we are in infancy stages, and based on what I hear. We all agree where we are, and we need to really focus on engineering solution to be able to really understand where our data goes, who has access to it, for how long, and what they do with it. So basically, full transparency is what I'm hearing from all of you that is really critical, right?
Yeah, and we just actually hit a major milestone. Mozilla reported that over half of websites are now HTTPS, so yay, thank you, let's encrypt. So I think we are still in the infancy, but we're totally getting there. We're slowly making standards. Eve and I both went to the IETF meeting in Berlin. OAuth, OpenID Connect are both making really great strides in authenticating devices and people to each other, making sure that they're sending data to the right places with the right levels of encryption. So a lot of great work being done, certainly more to do.
To add to that, I think that a lot of there are solutions that exist. For example, on your phone, there's ways to check where your data is going. And I think one of the things that we're still struggling with is how do we have users and provide the education for users on how to use those kind of privacy checks.
Go ahead.
Well, actually, I want to actually echo what you were saying. The usability of privacy and security is a phenomenal problem, because even though we provide, and certainly from an Intel standpoint, I'm wearing my Intel scarf for all the Intel people out there, we provide hardware that then supports the software to do various things, but if it's too encumbered to turn that thing on, it's not going to get turned on, it's not going to be used, and therefore the system itself is only as secure as the weakest link. If the privacy features are unusable, they won't get turned on. So it's not just that we need to create these standards, we need to actually make them and work with other developers to create APIs and so forth that are,
Engineer better.
engineer better.
Do you have something, Jill?
Yeah, I was gonna add, one of my employees was telling me a story just around the Maps application on the phone. And so to your point, he used it once on his phone to go from one place to another place. And that's all he wanted to use that Maps application for. Instead, a couple weeks later, he realized it was tracing everywhere he was going. And he was worried that if the police were able to get this, does it mark how long I'm stopping for at a stop sign? And is it tracking my speed? And can someone tell kind of my routine data and can it be used against me? And he's a security professional and he's coming back and saying, I had no idea this application was even collecting this about me.
The other thing to note is that on phones, the location information is actually shared across applications. So suddenly it gets turned on in one place, it gets used everywhere. So you need to be aware of that and decide that that's an okay thing. I can't imagine not using my phone for location services, but that's the side effect.
And in the consumer privacy world, you know, as lawyers and policy people, we've always looked to this idea of transparency and then decision making, empowering the customer, the user, just as you said. Because notice and consent, that's the regime, is a fundamental part of the fair information practice principles and is a way to really sort of say, okay, well, people are deciding. But I think that we've also got to the point where we understand that there's a fundamental flaw, which is that notice and consent does not actually protect privacy. It's actually the easy part of protecting privacy. It's not that easy, not that it is easy, but it's the easy part of protecting privacy. But then you still have all the rest of it to go on to security, which is hard. But also, once people decide, okay, I'm giving up this information, what happens next? Because there's all the derivative uses of the information that are hard for people to understand. And then there's, okay, well, let's say I didn't consent. Is there any remedy in the law to encourage the companies to really follow notice and consent? Consent can be obtained in all kinds of ways. Like, you know, if you need the phone to call somebody, you'll just say yes to anything. You know, so there's a lot of weaknesses. Notice and consent is really important, and it's very important to think about it ahead of time. It's part of privacy by design, building it into technology. But I think ultimately what we're going to find is that it is not by itself enough to really protect people's privacy.
So every time I go to a grocery store and I buy an item and I look at the nutrition label on the back, I always wonder, is there going to be a time where we go out there and, you know, physical devices that we purchase, where there will be a seal of approval from data privacy point of view, or it will tell you where your data is going. Do you foresee anything like that, standardization of what information will be published and provided to the consumers about the hardware that you use, the apps that you're using? I know there are all those privacy notes that lawyers create. They're long and they're not standard. So when, like you mentioned, when you're at the heat of the moment and you need to use that app, you go ahead and agree to anything. But do you really see in the future that we will have some kind of standardization across the board where there's going to be, you know, maybe a list of 10 things that will allow you to rate this product versus this product in terms of data privacy and also the applications that are alike?
So there's a project going on right now at the Kantara initiative called consent receipts. And the idea is that when you pay for something with money, you get a receipt back that says this transaction took place. But increasingly we're paying for things with our own data. So in order to use the phone, you have to give them your email address, you're gonna use the Wi-Fi, whatever. And the idea is that we can standardize this and we can say, okay, I gave you my email address. Here are the terms that you agreed to use it. And then ideally someday you could have a dashboard of here's all the places that you sent all of your information. Here's the companies that know your age, the companies that have your email address, the companies that have your zip code, those sorts of things, with the eventual goal that those companies will keep appearing in these dashboards and people will eventually recognize that, hey, maybe we should complain about how much data this company is aggregating about me.
So what stage is that project in?
It's a working group right now. It's an open working group. You're welcome to join. It's called Consent and Information Sharing, and it's at the Kantara initiative.
When I got started in this field in 1996, Lori Faith Craner was a graduate student back then, now a professor at Carnegie Mellon, I believe, and she's actually at the FTC now, the Federal Trade Commission, which is the agency of the government charged with protecting people's privacy. And Lori was working on something called the Privacy Bird, which was supposed to be a very easy way for people to tell when they go to websites whether the website was doing a good job, a medium job, or a bad job of protecting our privacy. There have been many, and nobody has a Privacy Bird, so that project didn't take off. It's a bird joke. But there have been many efforts to try to make the information concise enough to communicate to consumers, and obstacles to that, including the obstacle that people have different feelings about what privacy is and what information or what ramifications they are comfortable with or aren't comfortable with. I think it's very hard. People are certainly working on it, but I think it's very hard and not a novel practice for people to try to create this, easily consumable, easily understandable thing for privacy. Now on the security side, and I'll mention it, maybe you should talk about it, there are some efforts that are maybe even a little further along. Mudge is developing that sort of underwriter's laboratory program for security. Do you know about that at all? So this is basically to test devices and software to see if it meets security standards. And then just like the underwriter's laboratory has for electric devices, like your toaster won't blow up or your microwave won't blow up, to have like a sort of seal of approval that this has been assessed and by the lab, and that it's within the realm of okay, it's safe to use. And so Mudge and Sarah Zatko are doing that project. So I think that there are a lot of efforts along this way, but I think it's hard to get there, and I think it's particularly hard with privacy because it's such a personal idea about what people want or don't want.
You asked about also standards. Do we believe that there are standards that will be available that will help solve some of these inherent problems? There's, back to the notion of what's going on in the Internet of Things, when you look at the solutions, the end-to-end solutions in Internet of Things, they're often composite integration solutions. So no one single piece of software from a single vendor is going to solve the whole end-to-end problem. It's very heterogeneous. You're composing software components together. And as a consequence, what that means is that, okay, I have this solution end-to-end that now comes from many different vendors, each of which is touching the data and so forth. And so the standards that arise for this problem, there's discussion in several standards bodies, and they refer to it as semantic interoperability. They talk about smart objects. How do we tag data so that the policies that we attach to the data stay with the data for the lifetime of the data? Because once data's in the clear, somebody can copy that data, and suddenly all of those access control, all the policies are basically the rules about who is allowed, who's authorized to have that data, who can use it, who can copy it, who can make derivatives of it, under what conditions, for how long. All of those things are what I mean when I say policy. So how do you keep the policies around who should be able to manipulate that data with the data for the lifetime of the data? So the smart objects efforts in a variety of standards bodies, whether that's in W3C, the Internet Engineering Task Force, there are a bunch of IoT consortia, the OCF, OPC, some of these are like industrial IoT segments. They're all trying to figure out, how do we make objects, and the object can be either a cyber entity or like your data, or a physical entity, which might be a device, be represented in the cyber world in a way that it is self-describing. That's what makes it smart. So that now, when that device encounters another device, or that application needs to be composed with another application, it can describe itself sufficiently so it says, not only what I am, but so they're functional descriptions of that thing or object, and they're non-functional things, like the policies. Do they match up? So for the lifetime of that data, as it flows through all of those pieces, can the smart objects and the standards around them facilitate the preservation of the policies for the lifetime of that data? That's a really hard problem. It also speaks to, how do you even begin to describe the policies themselves in a way that's rich enough that you can create very elaborate elaborate policies. But then again, back to sort of Lori Faith Craner's work around the usability of policy representation languages. So there's standards on that front as well that are really provocative.
The one piece I wanted to add on taking it back to security, I think there's so many complex security standards, and there's specific ones for highly regulated industries, security standards for, and there's not one security standard. And if you think about the security requirements for a company to protect their applications or their products, or taking it back to IoT, it's really to protect consumer data and the integrity of that data. For privacy, again, I think the challenge is when you think about IoT, people have these devices because they want to be connected and they want to just ease of use and living this different type of lifestyle, and makes their life easier when you think about Amazon Echo or a Fitbit or any of these things. And I can't think of a privacy standard or one thing that's going to allow users to easily understand, because they do want to share data between devices with different things to make their life easier, to think of a standard when at the end of the day the users want to share this data.
So talking about standards, I know, Sarah, you're very well versed in UMA. It's a standard that, I think at the beginning, there were a lot of hopes that it would really pick up, and I'd like to understand if you can just talk about the pros and cons of that particular standard in terms of user managed access, and why do you think it hasn't really picked up at the rate that we were all hoping that it would really be propagated everywhere?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the working groups in the IETF is the OAuth working group, and that's a great technology. If you've ever used Login with Google or Login with Facebook, you've used OAuth, and it allows you to delegate access to yourself. Delegate access to your Google information to another application. What user managed access wants to do is delegate from me to someone else. So I want to share a picture with Eve. I want Eve to be able to log in with her own credentials, whatever username and password she wants to use. I want to be able to securely share with her in such a way that I know it's her, so it's not like a Google share link where anyone with the link can see the thing. I want to be able to make sure I know it's her and be able to share it with my consent, with my own access management policies about how long I want to share it, how high resolution I want to share it, whatever sorts of policies I want to put around it. UMA can enable that, but the standard has been, I think it started 9 or 10 years ago, so it's been in process for a while, and after we did the first technical implementations of it, we realized that it is very technically complicated, and we are currently in the process of vastly restructuring it so that it is less technically complicated, more simplified, which actually makes it more secure, because then it's easier for us to find the holes and the bugs in it. So I would encourage you to check out that working group as well. It's a really interesting project, and it'll be moving forward soon.
Thank you. Any other comments about standards? Any other standards that come to mind from data privacy point of view? All right. So now let's move on to, we talked about how a lot of companies are there's a lot of incentives out there to be able to sell your data, to share your data. How do you think people, just regular folks, if you ask them what happens to your data, where it goes, a lot of people say, oh, we trust Facebook, our data is there and it's secure. How can we entice people to be more sensitive to their own data, and also the companies to care more about privacy? So I think there's going to be a fine balance there. Do you guys have any thoughts on that? How do we educate people to be more sensitive?
Make it financial. I think that, so earlier on you were asking, why should people care about this? Why should companies care about this? Clearly, so I'm somebody who's had identity theft, and it is really difficult to ever trust that somebody isn't using your social security number and your driver's license number, and know that bank accounts are not being opened up in random places. So it's, from a standpoint of my time is money in some sense, so it's, in that sense, I care about it because it consumes a tremendous amount of my time to try to always be monitoring this. And there are services that can help with that. But from a corporation standpoint, they need to care about it for themselves because it's your IP, it's your intellectual property. If your intellectual property is leaked, then it costs money in some sense to recover from that. Your differentiation in the marketplace suddenly goes away. If you're a company who has had a breach of information, like a Target, I could probably name, a lot of companies, most companies probably had it. I wonder if there's some regulatory issues around making it required that when breaches happen, that consumers are compensated. And so, again, making it financial incents companies to do a better job at that. Now, so there's that part of the question, and then the other is for users, incenting them to charge those who use their data. On the one hand, that might incent users to share more of their information, but it would stop companies from the flow or the unnecessary flow of information. So what do you think of that?
Do you want to? Okay. Well, I think that we see companies start to care because their customers care, right? But there's categories of customers that care, and those are your corporate customers and your government customers. Corporate customers care because of IP and trade secret theft. Government customers care because they know that they're targets for surveillance from other governments and they want that information to be secure. And so you see things like Microsoft start to roll out different types of products for corporate business customers than are available or of interest to regular people. So how do you make regular people care? As I said, I don't think regular people will care enough, and so that's where government comes in. We do have data breach notification laws in most states now, but California's is one of the most comprehensive, and since almost every company has consumers or users in California, that's sort of the standard that so far has ruled. But what we see isn't that people, we see companies actually compensating users by compensating people whose data is taken by giving them access to like a subscription service to do credit monitoring or something like that. It's not that expensive for the company, but it helps the user feel better about it. And then what we've seen is that generally companies' stock prices have gone up after major breaches. TJ Maxx, Target, the price goes up. So there's no hit really for the privacy breaches in the marketplace at all. And so what's happened is that some governments have sort of stepped into the mix, and the most regulatory government is the EU. So any company that is doing business in the EU or whoever hopes to one day do business in the EU has to certify, you have to either comply with the EU Data Protection Directive, which is much more comprehensive than US law and privacy is, or you have to get certified under, it used to be the Safe Harbor, now it's the Privacy Shield. Eventually the Privacy Shield, in my opinion, will be struck down and there'll be something else. But you have to have a way to agree or to be able to assure your customers who are European citizens, European Union citizens, that you are protecting their information, making it secure, and also giving them control over the information and allowing them to take that information back from you and from everybody else you gave it to if that demand comes. So privacy regulation is a very big deal right now as companies strive to try to start to comply with all the privacy regimes, not just the different ones in the US and the different ones that US states have, but in Europe and then eventually around the world as other standards develop. So privacy is a very big legal business right now. For people who are also interested in the law and policy, it's required to care just as a pure business matter.
I just wanted to add, that's a really difficult, you stumped me a little bit when you asked that, because it's a difficult question to answer, and it's so complex, and to get, it's a user statement is not enough, but one of the things I think we can do, and I see a lot of user groups, a lot of groups emerging, is education for kids, and having kids learn what data means, what their personal data is. And it was interesting, I was having a conversation about this with several of my colleagues, but I think kids need to understand data, and they're using technology right now. They're using IOT, I think my kids use it more than I do. And I'm constantly teaching them about what that data means, what they're doing when they're doing these things. And I think starting at that will make users more savvy as they grow up and then they're more connected and they're using services that we currently use. I think that's where we really do need to focus in on, is making sure kids are educated and more savvy when it comes to understanding data and how it's being used.
Yeah, and for you guys, the nerds in the room, probably everybody in here, a fun thing to do with your kids is to sniff your own home network. So there's a great Lifehacker article on that if you want to Google it. Shows you how to sniff your own network. You can see all the devices that are connected to it, see if there's anything you don't recognize. Watch your Echo, pinging Amazon.com. You can look at all of your devices, where they're calling out to, and see if there's anything you don't expect, anything that's behaving strangely, so you can actually monitor your own privacy and your own devices. Fun thing to do, especially if you want to teach your kids about, like, they are actually calling Amazon and telling you to play Katy Perry, and it's actually going over the internet. Yeah.
Right. So talking about education, let's just go there, continue on that topic. Right now in our universities, when our kids grow up to go to school, there are not very many schools that have curriculums that are focused on data privacy. I know CMU, Carnegie Mellon, they have a master's program in data privacy, but I'm not aware of other schools. I know they have there are a lot of schools that have security programs, but not so much around data privacy. Let's talk about some of the courses, some of the classes, some of the things that we need to get our kids and teenagers and college age folks to be ready. And I'm not talking about just designing, the developers, but the whole, from product management to the legal, everybody who works at a company to know and be really savvy about what data privacy really means and what they need to do when they go into the workforce. Are there any? Do you have any information on?
So I guess it's not unlike the challenge that we have and that Grace Hopper Conference is trying to accomplish, which is about creating pipelines. And you need to start early. So yes, children are a wonderful community to work with because they grow up and suddenly they realize, oh, I'm looking for a job, and you can see the things I said on Facebook or wherever, that you've left these traces of yourself. And I think as people either have assets that they care about, or that they are looking for jobs, and they care then about what has been said or stored about them, they will stop sharing as much information. In fact, there's something called the Wayback Machine, which is something that's been taking a snapshot of the web since time immemorial. And so, as a consequence, you kind of can't get rid of anything that you've put out there. So people need to be aware of that. It's a great project, but it's a little scary. But to your point about then how do you create this pipeline, I think we need to get really creative. So some of the things that corporations have been doing, certainly like a place like Intel, is we have programs that fund curriculum in universities. We want privacy security nerds. We need to fund programs that are out there. Another thing that we've been trying to do, which I think I noticed that there are other companies doing this now, like VMware. We are going into a joint partnership with places like the National Science Foundation to have these joint solicitations in areas like cybersecurity and privacy, to generate research in universities, to be able to harvest that research and so forth, and to have graduate students that hopefully become employees and so forth. So those are a couple of the kinds of initiatives that are partnerships, industry, government kinds of partnerships.
Wonderful.
So I work at Stanford University, and universities are starting to have these programs for people who want to practice in the field, both in the technical world, so in the computer science department, and then also in the legal policy context, where there are classes about privacy and about surveillance. And I think those things are really important for professionals, right? If you're going to be in a field where you're practicing this. But I don't think that educating the public is going to work. That's because people can't understand enough. And I have 8-year-olds. They don't understand the difference between like streaming the content stored on the iPad and content that comes over the TV from the radio waves. Like, that's really hard for people to understand. I don't know how my car works. All I know is that it's safe for me to use. I don't know how my refrigerator works, but I know it's safe for me to use. People can't understand and shouldn't be expected to understand and to make these choices about all the devices in our life. And so I feel that there is a real role for some paternalism here. And it's paternalism on the part of law to say that these things need to be safe and that there needs to be some standards. And I think some corporate responsibility on the part of technology builders to say that we're going to build things that are safe for our customers to use. But I think it's a lot to ask for regular people, like in the grade school or in the high school curriculum, to be up to snuff on the kind of detail or level of information we would need to actually make those effective choices in the marketplace.
There's a lot of discussion in the Internet of Things around data analytics. Lots of discussion here at GHC the last couple days. And one of the ways I'd love to see it applied is to make some of these, when you talk about recommendation systems, to infer, I did set some policies at some point in time. Do I really have to set all the other hundreds of devices that I own and go through that whole process again? Can I make inferences about what do I typically do? What do my friends typically do? Sort of infer from trustworthiness and behaviors. So I think that that's an open challenge for people.
Wonderful. So we have time. Oh, you have a comment?
Yeah,
I just want to be sensitive.
Jennifer was going to respond to your comment about, you don't share your data with refrigerators and cars, but actually now we do.
That's the scary thing.
Yeah. So, but to that point, I think we do teach our kids to make good decisions, and so, as much as we can do to share, tell them, make good decisions around how you're sharing your data and understand that, but it is complex with technology.
Yeah, you're right. There's a baseline that we can go for, but it's not going to be the whole answer.
So awareness needs to be there, but we really need to design, just put a lot of pressure on the vendors and such. So we have time, a couple minutes, for one other topic, and that's staying anonymous in this world of Internet of Things. Anonymity, is this really real? Can we stay anonymous? Can our data stay anonymous ourselves? Opting in and opting out. So we have 3 minutes. I'd like to get your thoughts. Sarah, if you want to go.
So I hear a lot of feedback from people that says, oh, we shouldn't even allow anonymity on the internet. There's so many trolls, being able to...
You can't hear you. Oh,
Here, try this one.
Hello? Okay, there we go.
it's gone.
Did you get the question?
Did you get the question in the back? No. Okay, can you repeat? Oh. So I was actually asking, I was actually asking about staying anonymous in the world of IoT. Is this, is it real? Can we stay anonymous? And then talking about opting in and opting out.
So a lot of people complain about anonymity online, about harassment and abuse, and those are serious problems, but getting rid of anonymity is definitely not the way to change that. We need anonymity on the internet. For instance, in 2009, there was a contested election in Iran, and people flooded the streets, and there was a huge amount of police brutality. And we only know that because the people on the streets were able to tweet anonymously out of the country. And had Twitter said, you have to prove your identity, you have to tweet under your real name, those people's lives would have been in jeopardy, and that information would never have reached us. We would never have known that that was happening. So anonymity is hugely important for whistleblowers, for political dissidents. We absolutely need to have anonymity on the internet. I do believe we need to solve the harassment and abuse issue, but I think it's a different problem.
I've been thinking about this question, whether we can achieve anonymity, and it goes back to the question about how many pieces of information do we need about you to triangulate and say, oh yeah, that's you. So I think that in some ways, because there's so much data flowing, there are these unanticipated consequences of the frequency with which we're collecting the data. For instance, the way I got into this whole arena was that I was involved in an energy and sustainability lab. And when we started looking at whole house energy data, which was originally intended to be sent once a month to your utility company for billing purposes, but now through smart meters, gets collected every 10 minutes, we could see that energy data, which was about just the total use of my entire house, by being collected every 10 minutes, you could see when we were home and when we were not home, how many people were home, were we awake or asleep, what were our eating habits, what kind of appliances were we using, what were the actual appliances. The signatures of certain appliances are very crystal clear. So suddenly you're leaking all of this behavioral information. So it's clear that, so when now you talk about, okay, all of that information can be inferred from this data set, that's one data set. What happens when we start to combine data sets, whether it's about my energy or whether it's about I think the study that Jennifer was referencing earlier was about health insurance. And so you start getting access to all of these different data sets and you correlate across them. Suddenly I think anonymity is in jeopardy. So I think that's, yes, we need it, but we have to be careful that these data sets are now liberated and can be correlated across.
So I want to leave enough time for questions, and then I'll come back to you at the end for one advice that you could give the audience to stay safe in the Internet of Things as far as their data privacy is concerned. Are there any questions? All right, so there is a mic there.
I'll be checking Twitter too.
The hashtag again is GHC IOT.
Hi, thank you so much for addressing this topic. I'm curious what IoT devices each of you are staying away from based on privacy concerns.
That's a good question.
Any security cameras that advertise a P2P, that means that they're just throwing out what they have on the internet in order to get it to you. It's going through everyone else. So those are the sorts of devices that were used in the Mirai DDoS attack on President Security recently. I would stay away from those for sure. You guys?
You'll laugh. I do not have a Facebook account. But there was and part of it is that it's so voyeuristic. I'm sure I'd just be sucked in, and I don't have enough, time in my life to curate my real life, let alone my cyber life. But I do worry when people post information about where they are, that other people can infer where they're not, and so from a criminal standpoint, that's some of my motivation. It's not a device per se, but it's a technology.
Definitely cameras. We have a camera in our house so I can see the top floor of our house where my kids sleep, and just sort of securing that so that it didn't, to be clear, it defaulted to go out over the internet, but securing that so that it didn't happen was definitely a priority.
Yeah, also cameras. I think we installed the nanny cams and immediately uninstalled them, realizing that once we installed the application that's associated with it, it asked if we wanted to share things on Facebook, and I just didn't even want to accidentally press something like that, so that's what I stay away from.
Hi, I'm from Mora, and I'm from the University of Rochester. I'm a student there, and thank you for addressing this issue. I know for me, the more I learn about my privacy rights, I just find myself, I look for applications that are good about protecting those rights, but I just find myself more and more removing myself from situation. I start to delete accounts, and every time I come out of one of these talks, I think about deleting my Facebook, and so I'm just wondering, what do we do? Because I don't want to remove myself from, I'm in computer science is my minor, so it's a give and take. So how do you become a part of society with these privacy issues without participating?
This isn't really an answer, but I will say we really need your help. we need everybody to be working in this area to come up with technologies to thwart the bad parts of the additional surveillance, which has good qualities, like nanny cams can be good, or logging who's coming in and out of neighborhoods. We can have a big dispute about that, but in my neighborhood alone, just the speed, those signs that sit on the side of the road and take your speed, they also are monitoring, they have cameras in them, some of them do anyway. And we've been able to, the sheriff in our county has been able to track down various illicit members of society by just having access to their license plates numbers. So I guess that's a good side of it, but do I want them to know every time I'm coming in and out of my neighborhood? We really need your help to understand what kinds of technologies can help us use these things for good and minimize the negativity of technology. What do we do? Any other advice? I know that was paltry advice.
Yeah, we need your help. Build the new secure stuff.
there are going to be things where technology can help solve the problem, right? And some of that is deploying technology we currently have but is not used, like encryption. There are things that can be encrypted that aren't, and that companies are putting a lot of resources into doing. So after the Snowden disclosures, Google and Yahoo started encrypting their data center to data center transmissions. Google and Yahoo work together to ensure that when you email between those two services, that those emails in transit are encrypted. You'd be amazed how much of email traffic is still not encrypted, right? So there's things like that. Then there's developing new technology. So I have a colleague at Stanford who's working on how to do calculations on encrypted data. So right now, to do things like recommendations, Netflix needs to know all the movies that I have watched, and then say, well, you watched these movies, and Eve watched these movies, and she also liked this movie, so you'll like this movie too. They're developing tools and technology to learn how to do those kinds of recommendations on encrypted data. So I don't reveal to Netflix or to the government what books I read or what movies I watch or that sort of thing. But ultimately, there are going to be things where we can't encrypt. Metadata can be very hard to encrypt. Because it's needed in order to distribute information and make sure packets get where packets are supposed to go. And there, the answer has to be the law, right? We can't undersell the law too. The law can be a protector. Now the law is not going, the law, once you embrace license plate detection, then they're going to get you as well as the bad guys, and maybe one day you'll be viewed as the bad guy, and we need to figure out how to manage that problem. That's a policy issue and a legal issue. So there are organizations that you can follow or join and pay attention to, and there'll be times when they'll say, like, call your congressman, and then call your congressman, because those things really matter. Congress does actually listen. When if 100 people call their office, that's a big day, so they really actually pay attention to that. So I think there's a technological part to it, and I think there's a legal and policy part to it as well. I have a Facebook account.
But
I love Facebook.
yeah. But do you enjoy it when people tag you without your knowledge sometimes? After there was a talk about that yesterday from Lehigh University, so that was kind of interesting. I think we have time for the 2 questions. Go ahead.
In line with that, I think we talked earlier about education and how the foundation of that can really help the public kind of get a baseline of understanding, and knowing that that typically moves the needle forward with social activism and really getting our regulatory bodies to take action. I think we're at the cuspis of that. How long do you think it is before we have enough people in our society that are educated to the point where they demand from our regulators that they move and act quickly to make data privacy in this age something that is important to them and that protects us as a whole? Because typically it's a small group of people that understand the importance of it, that move that path forward and really educate the rest of our society on the importance of it overall. So how far away do you think we are? Because I'm not to play tomorrow.
So it doesn't take a majority of people to get something on the agenda and through Congress. It takes can take a vocal minority. But in this area of incentivizing regulators to do something about privacy, we can thank our friends in the EU. Europeans have a very different regulatory regime and have a very different attitude towards privacy than Americans tend to. Privacy is considered a fundamental human right on par with the way we think about the First Amendment and free expression. Americans love the First Amendment, and Europeans feel similarly about privacy. And because we're seeing this globalization of companies and they're operating everywhere around the world at the same time, they need to find ways to work with the European regime and also to satisfy European customers. And we don't usually create different products for different territories. So right now there's a lot of workarounds so that companies can kind of get out of strict compliance with EU data protection law. In some ways I think that's good, because data protection law can be very strict and interfere with innovation. And in some ways I think that's bad, because data protection law really does protect people from the kinds of harms that we've been talking about. But we have it's not just whether people care here, it's what the demands are around the world, and that demand really does exist for more privacy.
Last question.
You had talked a little bit about how do we make users care about their data, and that's one concern I have. Definitely having children, I worry about this whole numbness we have to sharing our data. I'm actually kind of curious how many of you installed the GHC app and how many people in this room, because reading it, I was just astounded to see that it was your browser history as well as all of your bookmarks, and it's just like, for what reason could they want this data? And I would never normally share this data. I went to a security talk yesterday that talked about how when we think about social apps, we kind of think about maintaining these boundaries, but we have all these other apps that we would normally have boundaries for. I wouldn't normally let somebody come into my home and just say, what have you been looking at? And so like, yeah, how do we overcome this numbness? Because I worry about getting to a point where we've gone too far. We may educate people about what they're sharing, but they're so used to already sharing it that it feels like there might not be a way to go back.
Yeah, what you described is productive paranoia. I think that you do want to be paranoid, but there's also a balance, because these apps also do a lot of good things too, right? The GHC app, for example. But I think we do have to, again, go back and go check those app settings to see what is being shared, what can you turn on and off, and then are you willing to take the risk of kind of sharing the data that, and are the benefits good enough in every decision that we make? So I think it goes back to that.
How many people did install the app?
How many didn't?
Sheer laziness,
No, oh yeah, but.
for me.
For me. You guys care about privacy and yet you installed the app. That's the problem that we have to solve.
Well, it's sharing. Again, privacy is sharing with the people you want to share with. They want to share with GHC, they trust GHC, that's fine. That's not a violation of their privacy, right?
I don't know about that.
So let's hear the last comment. Yeah, we should have another panel. Oh, do you want to comment on that?
Oh, I thought we were gonna do a whole set of last comments.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm being signaled that we need to leave the room, but we're gonna be here, and I'm sorry. Everybody will be here for another few minutes. If you have any questions, we were going to leave some room to give some advice, but I think through some of these questions, the advices came out, so I think we're good. But we're gonna be around if anybody has any last minute question, and you wanna come forward.